Something truly terrifying is looming in the Trump administration. And despite possibly possessing the worst consequences of any of the policies offered by the admin to date, it was covered for maybe a day or two. What I'm talking about is a proposed 2-year time limit on rental assistance. I'm well aware that this seems relatively minor, but it's not. Congressional Democrats need to get ahead of this ASAP, because if they don't, the working class will be pushed over the brink by this policy. Tenant-based rental assistance, also known as housing choice vouchers, has served as one of the main pillars of welfare within the United States for about 40 years. Roughly 5.5 million people, or 2.5 million households, receive about $30 billion on a yearly basis to partially subsidize rent for private housing. According to research conducted by NYU's Housing Solutions Lab, about 1.4 million of these households will likely lose their vouchers if this policy is implemented. The CBPP has placed the total estimate at 3 million Americans, more than half of whom are children. These findings raise certain questions. Chief among them, why exactly is the Trump admin proposing these changes? In a nutshell, their reasoning is motivated purely based on political philosophy. Their primary argument is that the reliance on rental assistance is supposed to be temporary. This is simply misleading. The flimsiest evidence that they could be referring to is the original demonstration status of the housing voucher program when it was passed in 1983. The Government Accountability Office uses this demonstration status
to test and evaluate the effectiveness of new approaches before they are implemented on a broader scale.
Congress made the prudent decision in 1987 to transition housing vouchers from this demonstration status, just like it does for hundreds of other programs that need to be tested. Trump's HUD could say that housing vouchers for individual families are supposed to be temporary, hence the time limits. That argument would be baseless too, though. The Housing Act makes no mention of time limits at all for housing vouchers. It only grants broad authority to HUD to impose them, which we'll get to in due time. The Trump administration is just making a circular argument. Their whole position isn't completely empty. They've also alleged that implementing this program will fix waste and fraud, which disincentivizes employment. This is a hastily drawn conclusion, though. Fraud and waste does exist under the voucher program. We're now entering the 5th year where HUD cannot identify improper payments. Here lies the crux of the situation. Faulty auditing procedures aren't indicative of widespread fraud or waste. A competent person would do their due diligence, expanding auditing capabilities to the Inspector Generals to get us an accurate figure. On top of unilaterally firing the various Inspector Generals, the Trump admin is rushing to politically motivated conclusions by proposing disastrous time limits. In their humble opinion, housing vouchers enables laziness and entitlement rather than effort and ingenuity. However, the economic data completely undermines this narrative, instead painting a much darker picture. A startling 2024 report released by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, titled Out of Reach, found that the median wage of renters in the US of $23 isn't enough to afford the average 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. Now, the Trump admin might take a look at this data and say it doesn't actually dispute the conservative position. People just need to work harder and smarter to afford rent rather than rely on subsidies. Not so fast. According to the CPBB, the vast majority of these households have an employed member. The remainder of adult family members mostly serve as full-time caregivers for the rest of the household. In other words, the members of these families work and take care of their households, and yet they can't afford rent. Wouldn't tenant assistance be an ideal program to address this issue, at least until wages increase to a suitable level? Unfortunately, it appears that the conservative political position doesn't take these realities into account. They are instead choosing to manufacture a housing crisis. So how do we go about dealing with this? What are our options? Allow me to start with the most promising option while you're still fresh. By the time this video is released, Congress will be facing its discretionary funding deadline for the 2026 fiscal year. We can leverage the looming government shutdown to force temporary appropriation riders in the 2026 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill, aka THUD. Housing vouchers are discretionary in nature, meaning their funding needs to be renewed on an annual basis. THUD can be passed with an additional limitation rider, let's say Section 430, to prohibit funds from being used to impose time limits on housing vouchers. Here's an example on how Section 430 might look if passed.
None of the funds made available by this or any act or any other act making appropriations for fiscal year 2026 may be obligated or expended to enforce or implement durational limits on tenant-based rental assistance under Section 8.0 of the United States Housing Act of 1937 unless mandated by Congress.
As I stated before, we can use this funding deadline to really squeeze meaningful concessions from the Republican majority. To do this, we might have to hone in on Republican congressional figures who represent large amounts of constituents receiving housing vouchers. We can also tap some of the more moderate Republicans too. Given the slim majority, these no votes will derail the reconciliation process until the limitation rider is passed. This can temporarily prevent HUD from imposing any time limit on housing vouchers, averting a housing crisis until the next reconciliation process. While we're on the subject of temporary solutions, we should briefly discuss citizen suits too. The Administrative Procedure Act, also known as APA, grants aggrieved citizens the general right to sue agencies such as HUD when they suffer legal wrong because of agency action. Once the HUD proposal is imposed, the plaintiff, either a single voucher recipient or a group, can file a suit along with a preliminary injunction, or at least a temporary restraining order. This all sounds like legal gobbledygook, but injunctions are especially powerful in stopping HUD. They can prohibit time limits from being imposed until the trial is over or the injunction is lifted. An injunction is pretty much a shoo-in for the simple reason that mass evictions will cause irreparable harm to those involved. This strategy isn't foolproof though. It would only buy us a certain amount of time. The problem lies with the underlying merit of the case. The U.S. Housing Act grants HUD broad authority to specify eligibility criteria, which may very well include total time spent receiving rental assistance. Only a judge can determine that at the end of the trial, so picking the right judge will therefore go a long way in securing a favorable verdict. I would personally suggest the Northern District of California or Southern District of New York based on their liberal leaning. Let's say that a temporary solution isn't good enough for you. What permanent ones do we have at our disposal? Well, instead of applying limitation riders every fucking year or fighting a losing court battle, Congress can just amend the U.S. Housing Act. To do this, an additional clause will have to be added which prohibits time limits, except for specific cases set up by Congress. Let's take a look at how it might look if passed.
The Public Housing Agency may not impose any durational limitation on the receipt of tenant-based assistance under this subsection, except as expressly provided by statute.
Under Loper-Bright versus Raimondo, Trump's HUD has essentially no authority to act outside of statutes such as this. However, the current administration is prone to brazen breaches of the law. They may feel enabled by the conservative majority in the Supreme Court to test the statute by ignoring it and imposing time limits anyways. If that's the case, then we ought to defer to our backup plan if need be. The odds of any of this happening are extremely low though. Simply put, amending the Housing Act to prohibit time limits is deeply unpopular amongst the Republican majority. We'll be hard-pressed then to find enough allies to vote for such an amendment as a result. Congress can also take a different, yet equally more difficult route if they wish to permanently block the proposal. The Congressional Review Act grants Congress the right to overturn rules issued by federal agencies. If HUD finalizes their time limit provision, they must submit the rule to both the Government Accountability Office and Congress for approval. The initial CRA joint resolutions are often subject to relaxed procedures, a civil majority in the Senate, and no filibuster. But the tricky part lies in the presidential veto. Trump will no doubt veto any joint resolution of disapproval, given that HUD is part of his territory. At that point, any chance of overturning the veto by a 2/3 margin is unlikely. That is, unless we spend a bit more time tending to the dark horse of the herd. Policy hearings are often viewed as procedural and marginally effective affairs. However, they can be extremely versatile, whether used in tandem with the previous strategies or as a standalone one. Depending on which way the wind is blowing in Congress, hearings can extinguish or fuel certain political efforts. They essentially function as formalized discourse, introducing key evidence, collecting expert testimony, and encouraging debate. As a result, congressional hearings receive special attention from the media, eventually spreading the policy in question to the broader public. Whether or not the public latches onto the hearing is up to the Democrats and their allied media outlets. They'll have to carefully strategize on how to best conduct themselves during the hearing, so that they can elicit a desired response from the public. Let's say this hearing is successful. It would ultimately place additional pressure on the Republican majority to prohibit time limits. This all being said, the tight spending deadline faced by Congress would make any hearing impossible. It would either have to be used during the lead-up of the amendment strategy or by itself. Hearings should almost always accompany some other congressional strategy, though. Extending the attention would increase awareness of the policy in question. It would be wise then to conduct the hearing along with the previous 4 strategies. Of the crop, it would be best to pair it with a time limit amendment. Let's not discredit the other strategies, though. They're each promising in their own right. However, the best without a doubt is the limitation rider. It exploits a key weakness faced by Republicans, the looming government shutdown. I won't sell the shutdown as a panacea, though. The Trump administration is gleefully packaging the shutdown as a pretext for steeper government layoffs and cuts. Given that this video is going to be released past the September 30th deadline, I've already made certain bets. Either the Democrats will force an immediate shutdown or pass a continued resolution. Regardless, a shutdown does seem imminent in both cases. In the lead-up of this drawn-out fight, healthcare has taken the lead stage amongst Democrats, who wish to reclaim lost Medicaid spending. Their message in both chambers is unanimous, which makes me believe that they are serious about this threat. Therefore, under the veil of this fight, Democrats should push this inconspicuous limitation rider. Let's say they do nothing, though, which is likely the case. What would this mean exactly? I'll leave that question up to you for now. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe click the notification button. Thanks again, everyone.